the value of a historical approach to this big subject, big problem or set of problems, I think the value is to make us conscious of alternatives to the way that we do things here and now. I think if we think about the alternative ways of doing things, then we become much more aware of the social forces that shape our own system of care. And if we become aware in this way, then we become aware of what kind of reform, what kind of change is possible, practical, in a given place and a given time. But before I launch myself into a historical account, there is one preliminary problem. What exactly is care? The term is a rather vague one. Actually, it seems to me to becoming vaguer and vaguer all the time. Today, North Americans use the phrase, "I care about you," when they used to say, "I'm fond of you," maybe even, "I love you." And then in English, and I think here in Brazil as well, instead of the old goodbye, some English people say, "Take care." And I've heard here people say, "Se cuide." So it's as if the whole process of everyday living was dangerous. Well, of course, perhaps it is. But that's not what I shall talk about. I'd like to talk about care in a more precise sense. Unlike Michel Foucault, I won't be talking about care of the self, what he called le souci du soi. It was the title of one of his last books. I'm going to concentrate instead on the care of four kinds of person: children, the old, the sick, and finally the poor. Of course, in many places, the old, the sick, and the poor are treated as if they were children. That's one of the problems of caring that we ought to think about. And now, what kind of history am I trying to present here? A history of caring might be a sort of psychohistory, that is, a history of emotions, especially the wanting to care for other people. But do such emotions really have a history? For example, were people more afraid in the Middle Ages than they are now? Of course, it's quite impossible to measure the level of fear, just as it's impossible to measure the level of the emotion of caring. All we can say, I think, is that in different periods, people are afraid of different things. We are less afraid of the dark, less afraid of the devil, but we've got other fears that medieval people didn't have. Something similar in the case of caring. I have no evidence at all that people cared about other people more in one century or than another, or indeed in one part of the world than another. So the history I'm going to present here is really a social history rather than a psychohistory, a history of the social organization of care and the history of social groups. for example, the carers. Who took care of children, the old, the sick, and the poor over the centuries? I just want to add a couple of points. The first, that the traditional site of care is obviously the family, more or less extensive. When English people think of family, they think of mother, father, and children. Now I'm incorporated into a Brazilian family, having married a Brazilian. I start to think of family as uncles and aunts and cousins and grandparents and great-grandparents, very a much, much larger group than I ever thought about in England. But the second point, what you might call the care of strangers, has actually got quite a long history. So my main theme will be the institutionalization of care, for better or for worse, or for both. Care for people outside one's family used to be dominated by the church, that is, in the Christian part of the world. Now it's much more likely to be dominated by the state. It's not so much an increase in care. I'd call it a displacement of care, from a move from one kind of carer to another kind of carer. I'm going to begin this story in Europe in the Middle Ages. I want to go back that far to present a situation which is very different from our situation today, whether it's in Europe or here in Brazil. But even in the Middle Ages, let's say from the year 1000 to the year 1500, even then, care was not restricted to the family. A village community might take collective care of the village idiot, as they would call him. In cities, the parish was an important site of care. The parish was the site of organized charity. A linked concept is that of mercy, which included both pity and generosity. Of course, the first hospital in São Paulo was called the Santa Casa de Misericordia. And that concept, misericordia, is very important in the Middle Ages. Again, the idea of God's poor, which you may associate with Mother Teresa, is actually a medieval idea that has survived into our time. Actually, beggars in medieval Europe used to claim, rather like beggars in Buddhist countries today, they used to claim they were doing more prosperous people a favor. The rich would give alms to the poor, but the poor, of course, were giving the rich the opportunity to gain merit in the eyes of God and be more sure of a place in heaven. In any case, the church recommended the faithful to perform what they called the 7 corporal works of mercy, or charity. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, visit prisoners, give shelter to the homeless, visit the sick, bury the dead. I find it interesting that care in the Middle Ages was extended to the dead as well as to the living. Dead people required a proper funeral and, of course, prayers for their souls. All that was part of care as medieval people saw it.
No próximo bloco.
A hospital in the Middle Ages was not a specialized institution for sick people. It was a general institution for caring for people who needed care. I'm not idealizing the Middle Ages. I don't think we should see them through rose-colored spectacles. There were generous people, of course, but plenty of people who were not generous, or were only, can I say, posthumously generous at the expense of their families, leaving money in their will, but not doing without anything in their own lifetime for the sake of the poor or the sick. Already in the late Middle Ages, there were many books about fake beggars, describing in vivid detail the tricks of the trade. You could hire children so that you looked as if you had a large family to feed, or you could pretend to be a cripple or to have some horrible disease. There's a tradition of behaving in this way which can be documented for at least 500 or 600 years, is probably much older. But then one asks oneself, who wrote these books and why did they write them? Was it to discourage individuals from caring too much? Was it to reduce feelings of guilt about not giving poor people enough? I don't know. But to compensate for the lack of individual generosity, in the late Middle Ages, institutions for caring began to multiply. So I'm going to mention 5. In the first place, almshouses. So places where a select number of poor people could live without paying rent. And secondly, free schools, so that children, almost always boys, could be educated without their parents having to pay. Ironically enough, one of those free schools in England, founded in the 15th century by the King, was Eton College. It's really changed a lot in the last 500 years. Then, in the third place, fraternities. So within the parish, a religious fraternity would take care of the families of its members. So if the head of the family died, then the other members of the fraternity would help the wife and the children. And especially, they would make sure that the dead person had a good funeral. Then in the fourth place, monasteries, because monasteries often organized the care of the poor. Like every day they would give food and drink to a certain number of poor people. And then finally, hospitals. A hospital in the Middle Ages was not a specialized institution for sick people. It was a general institution for caring for people who needed care. I'll give you one example from England. In Winchester, which is a cathedral city in southwest England, there was and still is an institution called the Hospital of St. Cross. It has been offering food to 100 people a day ever since the year 1132. It's a nice example of the strength of tradition in English life. But it wasn't a hospital in the modern specialized sense. People didn't yet distinguish between a place for poor people to live, a place that would distribute food like a soup kitchen, and a place for sick or dying people. Only at the end of the Middle Ages do you have a rise of what we might call medical hospitals, following the example of the Islamic world, the Middle East. So you have, for example, in Milan, a new and magnificent building called the Ospedale Maggiore, so famous that when people came to Milan, they visited the hospital alongside the cathedral and the castle. It was like one of the sites for tourists.
No próximo bloco,
People often fed the hungry directly, that is, handed out a piece of bread. We don't do this. We give money to organizations that themselves arrange famine relief. We don't care for the sick directly, many times, but we pay taxes which go to hospitals. Since then, there have been three major developments in the history of caring institutions in the West. The first is specialization, the second is secularization, and the third, it's a rather ugly word in English, marketization. Anyway, the rise of a market in caring, people buying care, people selling care. I'm going to talk about these three trends in order. Hospitals began to specialize in the care of the sick, like not only the care but also the cure. They became places from which patients could get up and walk away. They became much, much more numerous. It sounds incredible, but in the United States, in the year 1800, there were only 2 hospitals. 100 years later, there were 4,000 hospitals. So this is one enormous social change. More specialization, a particular kind of hospital to care for abandoned infants. If you go to Florence today, you're very likely going to go and look at a very beautiful building of the Renaissance called the Ospedale degli Innocenti. It was built in the 15th century at the expense of a guild, the Silk Guild, which was one of the richest guilds in Florence. And it was built because there were so many unmarried mothers who did not have the means to support their children. And they could take the newborn baby, write its name on a piece of paper that they would sew into its clothes, and place the baby in the revolving door. So the baby would enter the hospital, nobody would know who the mother was, nobody could see her. So hospitals like that are the ancestors of all our modern orphanages. Then there were hospitals which came to specialize in the care of the mentally ill. One famous case from London is the hospital called Bedlam. Bedlam now means confusion, but it was a way of saying Bethlehem. There was a monastery of Bethlehem. At the Protestant Reformation, the monasteries were abolished. So this monastery became a hospital. Gradually, it came to specialize in what people called lunatics. By the 18th century, people were beginning to regard the mentally ill as patients. And finally, in the 19th century, we see the professionalization of carers and their specialization too. So not just doctors, they're joined by nurses, joined by psychiatrists, and finally by social workers of different kinds. Now it's time to talk about secularization and the way in which the state, more exactly government, local government and central government, has been playing a bigger and bigger role in the organization of care ever since the 16th century. Why? Well, the 16th century was the time of the crisis of the church, the fragmentation of Christianity, the abolition of monasteries in Protestant countries. But there was also a social crisis. It's partly the result of bad harvests. The European weather was getting worse in the early 16th century. Harvests weren't so good. It's also the result of a population explosion. So more and more beggars coming to the cities. And that led to what sociologists today would call a moral panic. The government felt it had to do something. First reaction, send the beggars back to the parish in which they were born. So the big assumption in the 16th century is that caring is a local duty. But the policy didn't work. So some cities established what they called workhouses. The poor were fed, but not very much, and they were made to work extremely hard. In a sense, it's a form of care, but can I say it's a rather uncaring form of care, since in some places the conditions in the workhouses were deliberately made just bad enough to make people prefer to leave. And all the attitude of government only changed seriously in the late 19th century with the rise of what we now call the welfare state, beginning in Sweden and other northern countries and then spreading rather more widely. Why the late 19th century? Well, people in central government felt they had to intervene because the families were being disrupted by urbanization, which was a result of industrialization. I'm happy to say economic theory also helped. What people used to regard as idleness was reconceptualized as unemployment. If you think people are idle, then you think the best thing to do is to punish them. If you think they're unemployed, then you think they need care, they need help to get another job. The unemployed are assimilated to the sick or to the old rather than assimilated to criminals. So there was a process, you might call it the nationalization of care, a move away from the idea of individual charity or even small group charity to larger organizations administered by government. Later still, the internationalization of care, globalization, if you like. That is, the foundation of international organizations. The Red Cross, 1863, or Médecins Sans Frontières, 1971. Famine relief is now generally organized internationally through institutions like Oxfam. And both nationalization and internationalization have led to bureaucracy. The rise of a new profession, the social worker. The rise of a whole army of managers of care. They administer education, they administer health, they administer unemployment benefits, and so on. What used to be direct and personal has become indirect. In the Middle Ages, people often fed the hungry directly, that is, handed out a piece of bread. We don't do this. We give money to organizations that themselves arrange famine relief. We don't care for the sick directly, many times, but we pay taxes which go to hospitals. So caring is taking place, but it's mediated, it's bureaucratized. It may feel different, though it still, at least some of the time, reaches the people in need. Sometimes the solutions even turn into problems, which have to be solved all over again, knowing that at some future time, that brilliant solution will no longer be appropriate. In the United States, the market dominates, despite Obama's recent healthcare reform. In Europe, you can still see a division between the Protestant or ex-Protestant North and the Catholic or ex-Catholic South. In Northern Europe, still more public care associated with the welfare state, now in crisis, partly because of the numbers of old people in the population. In Southern Europe, more private care and a greater role for the old-fashioned institution of the family. As you see, the story I'm telling you is not a story of progress, at least not of general progress. Maybe lots of little progresses. For example, in the area of hygiene. In the 19th century, the British nurse Florence Nightingale reformed the design of wards in hospitals. She was worried about the circulation of the air. She wanted much more air in hospitals. So she told the architects there must be one window to every 2 beds. In this way, the patients will be more healthy. But that's very different from general progress. My picture of the past, history of care, not to mention the history of many other topics, is a story of problems, reactions to problems, attempted solutions to problems, and then over the years, as society changes, those solutions go out of date. Sometimes the solutions even turn into problems, which have to be solved all over again, knowing that at some future time, that brilliant solution will no longer be appropriate. So it's not a simple story of como cresceu o cuidado. And maybe this is probably typical of a historian. I want to give the last word to continuity, even in an age like today when we see so many changes. Quite a number of old institutions have survived into the 21st century, alongside the institutions that were supposed to supplant them, supposed to be substitutes. some churches still administer hospitals or orphanages. Or we could go back to the Hospital of St. Cross in Winchester. It's still there. It still gives visitors, if they know that they have the right to ask for this, a piece of bread and a small glass of beer. I did this myself once, and I got it. In Italy, some of those old fraternities still survive. In Venice, the Scuola Grande di San Marco. The Scuola is now a hospital, a proper medical hospital. But there are also volunteers, and they still perform the 7 corporal works of charity or mercy in the traditional manner. They even wear hoods like their medieval predecessors to keep their anonymity. They want to care for people, but they don't want anyone to know who they are while they're doing it. As far as I can see, of course, everybody here knows more about this than I do. As far as I can see, traditional attitudes and institutions still survive in some parts of Brazil, or at least they did until quite recently. It was in the 1980s I first made a visit to Minas Gerais, among not only to bigger cities, but to some quite small ones. In one small town, I met an old lady who said she was a member of an Irmandade. So I asked her why she joined. And she said, I want to be sure of having a good place to be buried. That's pure Middle Ages. I mean, so many medieval people made the same decision to join that kind of institution for that exact reason. And as far as I can see, but you may contradict me, the family as an institution seems to be, as a caring institution, seems to be in better shape here in Brazil than in Britain and other European countries. And that, needless to say, impresses me more and more every year as I grow older myself. I start to think, suppose I became unable to care for myself. What would happen to me in Britain? I'd be sent to an old people's home. Not one of the best ones, because I probably haven't got enough money to pay for that. What would happen to me in Brazil? I'd be put in the house of some member of my extended family. I'd be deposited in a corner, observing the activities that I wasn't able to take part in anymore. Well, I know which I'd prefer: personal care by people I know. What about you?
A gente se sente talvez amedrontado diante da possibilidade de que a família, como instituição de proteção social, esteja em vias de extinção, embora não pareça, ou não pareça relativamente à Inglaterra. Então eu pediria um pouco que, se possível, né, se voltasse um pouco sua análise um pouco para qual que é o futuro dessas instituições de previdência social, de welfare state, ou de état-providence na França, né? De qual que é o futuro disso diante dessa globalização, né? Uma transnacionalização que nos faz cada vez menos significativos, né? Diante das instituições de cuidado de saúde ou de previdência. É isso.
I'd like to make 2 comments about that. I mean, the first is that I think when one is comparing institutions in different countries, usually each one has its own advantages and disadvantages. And to put this very crudely, but that might stimulate a discussion later, I feel that Northern Europe is much better at public life than Brazil. But I don't think it's as good at private life as Brazil. And I think that these two things are connected. So to have a large and caring family is very good in one way, but then that means that you have political families as well. But that's my first comment. The second comment is about the future, since you asked about it. And the near future is not very bright. I mean, I've just left England a week ago, where the government is about to announce enormous cuts to the social services and to the social security that you were talking about. This is happening in France. I saw in the newspaper that all the people who were demonstrating in Paris against cuts which, whatever they do, are going to have to be made, because otherwise the government can't balance its budget, and if it doesn't, it's paying so much interest on the loans that the taxpayer has to pay this huge bill. So even Sweden, which used to be the flagship of the welfare state, is cutting back. That in a democratic system, the majority of voters throughout the Social Democratic Party that had been so much associated with the welfare state. So there is this crisis. It seems like a golden age now, but when I was an adolescent, the National Health Service was new in Britain, and it seemed to work so well. And now it seems to work so badly. Partly it worked well, I think, because many people didn't use it. It took time for people to realize they had these rights. And then when everybody starts to make demands on it, the system can't cope. So what looked like a wonderful public solution to the problem of caring in many areas doesn't look so successful now, and its future looks even worse than its present. I'm sorry to have to say that, but this is very much how it looks to me now.